All right, everybody, welcome to our fifth tax chat. And today the topic is low income taxpayer clinics. And this is about an international movement. It started in the United States in the 70s, affiliated with law and business schools, and with the enactment of the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act in 1998 and a funding stream, federal grant program. It went from 14 programs to about 135 or so today, and a 13 million US dollar funding stream. It's moved to Australia and then picked up in Ireland and England. And we're hoping that part of what we can get out of this tax chat, as you hear folks from these different clinic movements talk, that we will actually get more people interested in this movement in different countries, and we will be able to get much more activity going. So with that, I'm going to actually just do an introduction of the speakers and then just a little bit of information. If you have questions and while people are talking, please go ahead and put it in the chat. And if it fits into the flow of the discussion, we'll ask it at that point of the speakers. And then at the end, we'll reserve some time so folks can ask questions directly. This is being recorded, so that's just so we can put it up for other people to hear. And away we go. So our speakers are Keith Fogg, who's from the Federal Tax Clinic at Harvard Law School in the United States. David Massey and Amy Lawton from the Northwest Tax Clinic at University of Lancaster in England. And Amy is actually at the Edinburgh Law School, and I think she's trying to get a clinic started there, but she's working with the Northwest Tax Clinic. We have Annette Morgan and Donovan Castelyn, they're from the Curtin Tax Clinic in Perth at Curtin University. And although Annette right now is in the United States, we do have to acknowledge that Donovan is here at 1 a.m. in the morning, Australia time. So we are very grateful to him making that sacrifice. Emer Mulligan from the Student Tax Clinic at National University of Ireland in Galway. And then finally, David Sams, who is the Executive Director of the Community Tax Law Project, which is in Virginia. And David is the executive director of the clinic that I actually founded back in 1992. And so we have a bunch of representatives from clinics that are associated with law or accounting firms. And David is the freestanding NGO, nonprofit organization type clinic. So I think, the first thing that we were going to start off talking about, just to get sort of grounded, is for each clinic to kind of talk about their framework, maybe take 5 minutes each to just explain the types of taxpayers they serve, the services they offer, the scope of their activity in terms of what geographic areas they cover, and if they have any eligibility requirements. So I'm not sure where we want to start. Maybe with Australia, because it's an A. How about that? So Annette, do you want to go, or Donovan?
I'll go. Thanks, Nina. So thanks for having us on the tax chat. It's great to be asked to be part of this. So we started, Donovan and myself, the first sort of prototype of a clinic based on myself being in the US and listening to Nina tell us about the low income tax clinics. We'd had previously had a concept, but I think just seeing how it was working in the US gave us the groundwork to move forward with the pilot. From the pilot, which was very successful, the Australian government and tax authorities liked what we were doing, and then announced that they would fund another 10 universities, or 9 in Australia, and fund us to the tune of around $100,000 each. At the end of 2019, the government then committed another $4 million and to continue the clinics. Now, currently, the clinics in Australia are a little bit different depending on which jurisdiction they are in the different states and territories, but there's usually 1 to 2 in each state or territory. We in West Australia just have the one. There has been a non-supported government-funded one start up in another university, which Donovan and myself assisted in getting them going. So we have one. We offer our services to what we call unrepresented taxpayers. So it's those taxpayers who don't have the financial means or other criteria to obtain professional tax assistance. We provide a thing in Australia which the government did pinch off us, which we call AREA. So it's assistance, representation, education, and advocacy. So we go into those 4 different categories. So assistance may be helping different taxpayers, and it might be very simple, helping them with their ongoing tax affairs and they want to ask questions. We lodge our tax returns online through a government system or through a tax agent. Some people don't feel they need to use the services of a tax agent, but might have a query, so we assist there. We also assist with debt reduction or debt waivering, hardship applications. We advocate on behalf of this special group of taxpayers who usually don't have a voice in Australia. We also represent their clients in the court system where they're being prosecuted by the ATO for a number of different things, might be failing to lodge tax returns, being prosecuted for outstanding taxes, and also through the tribunals, administrative tribunal, where taxpayers or the tax office have run through the tax office objection period and now it has to enter the court system. So we help represent there. Now, our clinic uses the services of pro bono, more legal services to assist in that area, but we are looking very closely in 2021 to moving our clinic to being the one-stop shop where, you know, in our circumstances, I am the registered tax professional and hold those qualifications. Donovan is a solicitor, and we'll be expanding it so we can operate both as an accounting tax as well as a legal service. So the clients, we don't have to go and find pro bono representation. In Australia, it has grown. A lot of tax professionals themselves wish to get involved on a pro bono basis and are offering services. And I think later on, we're going to talk about how we're looking at changing a little bit in Australia. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Nina.
Great. Well, let's see. If we're going alphabetical, where am I? Australia, then is it Ireland next, or would it be England next? I guess maybe maybe David, or Amy, you might want to talk, and then we'll go to Ireland.
Thanks, Nina. I'm going to do the introduction and then leave all the really difficult questions to David later on in the chat. So the Northwest Tax Clinic is currently the only student-led tax clinic in the UK. And we have a collaboration between Lancaster University, the University of Central Lancashire, which geographically in England are very close neighbours. So we're very close to each other physically, and we also work with an external partner, which is the charity called TaxAid. Now, TaxAid have a long-standing history in the UK of helping low-income taxpayers sort out their tax affairs. So by partnering with TaxAid, we essentially were benefiting from their wealth of experience and knowledge in dealing with low-income taxpayers, and also being able to anticipate the sorts of queries, questions, and things that we would need to do in the clinic as well. So we started the clinic at the very start of 2020, so we're really quite new. So we had a pilot that ran from January to March 2020, which was a success, and we've now rolled out on a permanent basis since October 2020. Now, interestingly, it's actually also a collaboration between a law school and a business school. So we have a mix of both law and business students in the Northwest Tax Clinic working together. Now, pre-COVID, what that meant was that all the students were in a room together and they could talk to each other. So law students were actually mingling with non-law students, which was absolutely fantastic for the students at Lancaster and UCLan as well. And it meant that they could use the strengths of each other to work through the cases. So the accounting students could do all of the numbery bits, and then the law students could work with the words. Obviously, that's changed with COVID as we've brought everything online, and that's brought challenges in itself that I'm sure we'll explore later on in the session anyway. So we have our students who are essentially front-facing as a student-led clinic. and they really communicate with the client from the offset. From when the client picks up the phone to researching and communicating and holding appointments with the clients, it's the students that does it all, really. They do it all. They do so under the supervision of professional tax advisors. So we also have a network of volunteers who help supervise the work and research that our students are doing, just to make sure that it is accurate and that we're providing the correct advice to our clients. Now, the demographic of the clients we tend to help is we have a threshold. We essentially follow and align ourselves with the values of TaxAid because of our partnership with them. Now, because of the funding that TaxAid receive, we tend to have a threshold where we won't help an individual on an annual income of more than about £20,000. Okay, and the idea being that we're not helping people who would otherwise be able to afford professional tax advice. It's about $27,000, I think, there or thereabouts. But we've tended to find during our experience with the clinic that actually most of our clients don't come anywhere near that anyway. So that's not necessarily been an issue for us. And in terms of wider demographics, we've helped individuals of all ages, so not just young people, not just older people. And we tend to find that the individuals we're helping have other things going on in their lives beyond the tax issues that they're facing as well. For example, mental health difficulties. We have clients who are digitally excluded, and actually, particularly in a current context where we're unable to provide face-to-face support, the clients that we do help do value that face-to-face support as well, which has made COVID a bit more of a challenge. So we help on income tax issues. So people in the UK don't automatically have to submit a tax return, which has made it very interesting and provided challenges in marketing our services and the clinic. But we do help, similarly to what Annette mentioned. We either assist and fix tax issues, we submit tax returns, we appeal debts, we appeal penalties, but we also try and educate as well. So I think that's everything in a nutshell from me and the North West Tax Clinic.
Great. Well, then, Emer, you want to talk about Ireland?
Right, thanks. Thanks, Nina. Fantastic to get this opportunity to talk about this initiative and I guess be part of what you describe as an international movement of sorts. Yeah, so we set up, I'm based in the National University of Ireland, Galway, as Nina said, which is on the west coast of Ireland. And this is, I believe, the first attempt at this type of initiative in Ireland, certainly in terms of it being rooted or coming from the university. So basically, I suppose at a personal level, I loved when I came across the idea of the tax clinic, because I've always, having taught tax for 20 years, I've always told my students they're quite a privileged group, not because I teach them, but because they come out of university with this skill set already. And an understanding at some level, we hope anyway, of taxes. And of course, this is something that all citizens need to deal with and understand, either in their own country or when they travel. And I've always thought there was some kind of an inequity around that this kind of almost like privileged status in terms of tax knowledge. So when I got to know about the US clinics, particularly via Nina, and more recently about Australia via Annette, I was very grateful because I thought this is exactly what might work here. But I was equally also very conscious of the fact the way it was happening in the other countries may not necessarily translate to Ireland. So I had to put some thought into that, and I know we're going to maybe touch on those differences later. So in any event, it's new, and I'm in what I would call phase 2 of 3 phases, as I mapped it out when I put my thinking cap on with a number of colleagues last year. So we commenced in the 1920 academic year, if you like, with a pilot. And we decided to restrict this pilot to serving, if you like, a select number, as you do in a pilot phase of anything, of NUI Galway-based students. And students, as you know, we have your regular full-time students, we have part-time students, but we also have quite a significant mature student base. So the idea was to get a good cross-section of students and try to run this pilot to see how it might or might not work in this Irish context, and particularly when we're running it in the university. We've learned a whole lot of stuff from that, which I'm very happy to share at a later stage. The plan then is for phase 2, which is the current year, which we're currently doing, is to roll it out in a full sense across the university with a PR and marketing campaign, which is currently being put together. And phase 3 then, which is next year, is to roll it out to the wider community with a particular focus at the moment on looking at organizations like enterprise centers, etc. So in other words, to work with existing community groups that might see very clear needs for the services of the tax clinic. The model is very similar in this respect to the previous 2 speakers' models, which is I too also, and I'm very grateful for the input of professional tax advisors who are giving of their services on a pro bono basis. And I'd like to give a shout out to a couple of them. I just see their names hopping on here. Sandra, Mary and Florita. I'm not sure if any of the others are there. It's great to be working with them in this context. And I think that certainly, you know, works to the community engagement level of what we try to do in universities more broadly as well. So from a teaching point of view, what's fantastic is obviously the pedagogy here. We have our tax students involved, and they're learning on the job, so to speak. And whilst on the legal side of our university, there is some clinical and applied workshops opportunities, there's very little in the business school in this sense, other than outside in terms of internships. So it's great to give them this clinical experience, if you like, as part of their education. Mind you, again, I think this is common to a lot of our initiatives. What they do for us in these clinics does not count for their grading. So some of the academics present might be interested in that particular dimension of it. And this pro bono dimension has turned out to be very important, both from the point of the advisors, the professional advisors, and indeed the tax students themselves who are getting involved. So in terms of the demographic we're serving, if you like, initially it's very clear, it's the student body, and next year that will be changing. The kinds of issues we have focused on tended to be, you know, at one level very basic, but to people who don't know about them, they're rather complex. We have online filing, like a lot of your countries do. So a lot of these, for a lot of our students, it was just, are they able to manage that? Are they actually, so a lot of them come to us, we put them through a thing called My Account, which is the online section, if you like, of the revenue that they all have to deal with and become familiar with. And the whole idea is to try to educate. So education is a big part of the rationale for our clinic, so that people can walk away from the clinic and have enough, if you like, knowledge to look after themselves in the immediate future in terms of their own tax filings, etc. We dealt with people who were in a position they thought of being entitled to a tax refund, but didn't know how to go about it. Being students, a lot of them had a number of part-time jobs. This was last year, of course, not this year. So again, this is rather can be complicated and challenging for people where they have multiple employments. How does that work from a taxpayer point of view? We also, in terms of a big part of what we did in terms of the tax students coming on board in our clinic as advisors, they had to be trained, separate training outside of what goes on in our classroom context. And we've invested quite a bit in that, and that goes well beyond the tax technical material into the professional interpersonal skill set that they need to have a command of before we can put them in front, if you like, of a client. So again, we have somebody with significant practice, up-to-date practice experience who administers that training session. I would like to mention we have the support also of the Irish Revenue in what we're doing. And that has partly fed into maybe some of the emphasis that we and I know I'll talk about this later, is how we decide what to focus on in these clinics. We're liaising with the revenue on that as well. And we have this year also, I've taken on a postdoctoral researcher. Maggie hopefully is on this call as well, because now I'm commencing a research project around tax clinics from multiple perspectives. So I think this is going to run and run, Nina, and I think the whole idea of an international, collaborative initiative around research as well in this context would be very, very welcome. We don't have any major eligibility rules around income at the moment. That's something I think we're going to have a very close look at when we roll it out to the community in phase 3, which is next year. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit from my colleagues here on that matter as well. You know, when I set this up first, the idea was very much with the focus on what I called in a marginalized communities. So I think we do have to look at the economic dimension of that in terms of giving our help. So that's kind of a quick round the house, Nina, in terms of what we're doing. But obviously, we'll come back to some of the challenges later. Although I would like to mention one other thing for the record, is we got funding that allowed us to commence this from the Student Project Fund at NUI Galway, and I'm always very, very grateful for that.
Great. So before we move, thank you. So before we move to the US, I thought I'd just give some background about the US movement. You know, Keith Fogg has written a really important article or articles about the history of the movement. And I put links, and I will put links when this video is posted onto our YouTube channel. But my entry in was being asked as a newly minted lawyer to do pro bono work, and realizing that my whole background was tax, and there was nowhere that I could find to do pro bono work in the area of my expertise. And so I founded the Community Tax Law Project to be a vehicle. Yes, there would be attorneys on the staff, but there would be the pro bono panel was incredibly important. And of course, there was no funding for that. And the law schools had been doing clinics since the 70s or maybe even the late 60s. But their funding had also dried up. So it was really down to about 13 or 14 law schools in the United States that were doing clinics at that time, law and accounting schools. And then the Community Tax Law Project was the freestanding one. And I was given the opportunity to testify before Congress in 1997 and 1998. And Janet Spraggins, who was at American University, had testified before a restructuring commission in the United States to make the case that you really needed a funding stream to fund clinics that represented taxpayers, not preparing returns, because there was already a long-standing program in the United States called volunteer income tax assistance, which were volunteers who helped with the tax filing responsibilities of taxpayers. And unlike many of the countries here on the video, the United States has a really robust self-assessment system. You know, there isn't any, you know, pre-populated returns or things like that. You have to lodge your return. And we do pull a lot of millions of low-income taxpayers into this tax system by virtue of refundable credits for the working poor. They have to file a return to get those credits, and that pulls them in. So we felt that these taxpayers needed representation, and also there needed to be some systemic advocacy. A voice for their issues needed to be raised to the United States. And that led to the enactment of 7526 of the Internal Revenue Code, which is the authorizing statute for the grant program. It basically said that the grants were available to organizations that represented taxpayers, low-income taxpayers in their disputes with the IRS, and for conducting outreach and education to taxpayers who spoke English as a second language. Those were the two funding criteria. And then there was an income eligibility criteria, which was basically based on the criteria of my clinic. I had established it at 250% federal poverty level. And the thinking behind that, although that goes up fairly high if you look at it and covers a lot of people, was that legal aid societies who represented taxpayers and got federal funding for non-tax issues and non-criminal issues were limited to 125% federal poverty level. And I felt that 250% got the working poor, people who, still did not have the means to slap down a $5,000 retainer to an attorney to represent them in the United States tax court or before the IRS. That would often be more than the tax liability itself. And that was actually adopted into the program criteria, that 90% of the cases taken would have to be at or below 250% federal poverty level. And so that gives the background to what caused the growth of the clinics in the United States from 14 in 1998 to over 135 today, was the ability to have funding, and it is matching funding. So for every federal dollar, you have to raise another, but your raising of the match can be in kind, so that if you have volunteer service, you can count their time, their contributions of their time at a particular rate to meet your match. And so I think with that background, maybe I'll go to Keith, since we're sort of doing United States in an alphabetical order within that, and then we'll wrap up with David Sams, who's on for the non-academic clinic. So Keith, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to give a little bit of history as well, but you've given a pretty complete history. I'll just say that back in the first clinic that I could find in the United States was at Harvard Law School back in 1966, but only lasted for a semester or a year, really, because there wasn't at the time in the U.S. tax system, there wasn't really, poor people in the low income bands weren't being brought into the tax system, and there also wasn't a desire to have law students compete with lawyers. And so the first clinic that really stuck was in 1974, and there was a pretty significant study by the American Bar Association and the IRS about what clinics should be allowed to do in the mid 1970s, when clinics were first beginning. And we'll celebrate 50 years of tax clinics in just 3 years from now. So a little over 10 years ago, I was running a program for the American Bar Association that when we were having a meeting in Toronto. And so I contacted the chief judge of the Canadian tax court to have him put me together with the clinics in Canada, only to learn there were no clinics in Canada. So we changed our program from having clinics in Canada talk to having the US clinics talk about the history. And it was out of that program that I ended up writing my article on the history of tax clinics in the US. But I'll talk about my the clinic that I run at Harvard, which I started in 2015. So I worked for the government for 30 years before retiring and going to work at a clinic at Villanova Law School, which is a clinic that's almost 30 years old now. And so it had been in existence for quite a long time when I joined, and I was very fortunate to join a clinic that was existing. I didn't have to invent the wheel. I'd never taken a clinic course in law school. My clinics didn't exist when I went to law school in the 1970s at the law school that I attended. And so I learned a lot working at Villanova, and then I was fortunate to be asked to start the clinic at Harvard, where we are a student-run clinic. Students take a course for 1 semester. They have both they have responsibility to represent individuals, and they're working 12 to 20 hours per week on the representation side, and they have also to take a 2-hour seminar each week that teaches them things that they need to know in order to represent clients effectively. We represent people in some type of tax controversy before the Internal Revenue Service. About half of our cases involve collection. That was also something that didn't exist as much back in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the Internal Revenue Service began accepting offers in compromise. And so that's a big part of what we do today for half of our clients, is try to compromise their liabilities with the IRS. We represent, as Nina said, on the federal grant, individuals making less than 250% of poverty, which in the United States today is about $32,000, and then another $11,000 for each additional member of their household. However, in Boston, that is not so much. I mean, so that the 250% of poverty is a nationwide number. And so in parts of the United States, in the rural and Midwestern parts of the United States, you can live a pretty nice life at that dollar amount. In Boston, you live under a bridge. So it's very hard to find housing in Boston if you didn't have family or friends, if you were only making $32,000 a year. So I actually, I wrote a grant, a statute for the state of Massachusetts, which also provides a grant to our clinic, which this year is actually more than the federal grant. And they use 400% of poverty as the number there because of the cost of living in the greater Boston area. So our clinic not only represents people with federal controversies, we represent people with state controversies. The states are, in many of the states, are more aggressive today in collecting taxes than the federal government, because states, unlike the United States government, cannot print money, and they have to operate budgets that actually balance. And so states are very aggressive, and we have many clients who have resolved their federal problems and have more difficulty resolving their state problems. We represent people in the United States Tax Court, in the audit stream, and as I said before, in the collection stream. In our clinic, we were started at Harvard because my clinic is a part of what's called the Legal Services Center at Harvard, which is a collection of 7 civil legal services clinics. One of those 7 clinics is a veterans clinic, and the veterans clinic found that many of its clients had tax problems, and they were the clinic that drove the creation of the tax clinic. So we probably have 10 to 15% of our clients are veterans. Part of the Legal Service Center is also a domestic violence clinic, and we have a fairly large client base of individuals who have been the victims of domestic violence. Like some of the other clinics who have talked here, we also have a pro bono panel. Our pro bono panel consists not only of lawyers, but also of enrolled agents who are enrolled agents in the United States, have been given permission to practice before the United States tax authority, and they are very active in Massachusetts, and we have a very flourishing partnership with the enrolled agents who help us with their cases. And I'll stop there and let David talk a little bit about his clinic.
Okay, David, you want to go ahead?
Sure. This is kind of a difficult one because there's 2 people, on my screen. They're actually to the left and right of me. Keith and Nina know probably more about the Community Tax Law Project than I will ever know. But I will tell you a little bit how we are different. Actually, we're not that different from the Harvard Clinic, because we do also get a state grant that is at this point almost equivalent to our federal grant, but we're in the process of putting together a proposal where it will become larger, like Keith's state grant is. We also seek federal funding from private sources, such as family foundations, individual donors, law firms, accounting firms. So part of my job, I would say probably 40% of my job is fundraising. So I'm very immersed in the fundraising world as much as the legal world and the tax world. So I wear a number of hats. I quite enjoy it. Our previous director, which actually is now at the IRS and has Keith's old job. He always said he didn't like begging for money, but I keep telling him it's not begging for money. It's just explaining why it's a good idea to give money to the Tax Law Project. So it's a lot of fun running the Tax Law Project. Obviously, I have very big shoes to fill, but we have the ability to be a little bit more free than we would be if we were in a law school or if we were in a legal services department. We still operate under the 3 pillars of the LITC program, such as representation, education, and advocacy. But because we have a fairly robust pro bono panel, usually our panel consists of between 60 to 70 lawyers, enrolled agents, and accountants. About 30 of those are active at any time. So we do have a fairly large caseload at the Community Tax Law Project, and that's how we accomplish that. Without having it being student driven, we are 3 attorneys strong at the moment. We actually do have 2 ABA fellows that we're very proud of right now, which is great. So we are also a clinic that is very, very supportive of the ABA tax section, specifically the Pro Bono LITC committee. So that's a really, really big advantage of being in the United States. We have, I can email Keith about a question, or 130 other practitioners that are all just fabulous human beings and do great work about different topics. And within minutes, I will get an answer to a question. And we do that through listservs, emails, different things like that. One of the things that we like to do is we always go back to our mission. And we do follow the 90% of our clients have to be within the 250% of the federal poverty. But on those 10% ones where it becomes a question, we're like, it's almost like I have Nina on my shoulder saying, look at the case, make sure that that person has access to rights as a taxpayer. And that's what we always go back to, and that's what we keep looking for. We have a lot of different programs, and they change over time. And because of the history of Community Tax Law Project, you know, I can go in my closets or in our server files and find presentations that date back like, you know, 15, 20 years on all sorts of different topics, and take a look at what we've been talking about. We pretty much presented on almost everything you could think of that affects a low-income taxpayer. So we do a lot of education. In fact, this morning I presented for an hour to a group of people in a job readiness program that the Community Tax Law Project has been taken part of for probably about 15 years. The same local government program for helping people go from government assistance to having their first jobs. So we make sure that they know what their basic requirements are as a taxpayer, and also their rights as a taxpayer, what their credits are, that they're available, that kind of thing. We do a lot of different things at the Community Tax Law Project. We've been able to, during COVID, we've been able to exercise the advocacy side of what we do. You know, a lot of times during the year, normal years, we will just be answering questions from Congress people or various other practitioners. But this year we've actually, along with Nina and Keith, we've been working on a lot of other projects that we've been able to actually, you know, really get really close into working with changing legislation, looking at litigation that's changed things. We've had some amazing pro bono attorneys on our panel that still are on our advisory board that have the litigation that they've worked on has changed statutes so they look the way they are now. It's quite an amazing history of the Community Tax Law Project, and you know, it's quite nice being able to be a little bit independent, because I can twist and turn and move and do different things as we see fit, as far as completing our mission, as far as giving voice to low-income taxpayers in the system in Virginia. We're statewide, but we do have 2 other clinics, Northern Virginia and Washington, the Lee Law School. So we cater to pretty much everywhere in the state. And right now we actually are picking up some of the slack for West Virginia, who currently does not have a clinic. So we're picking up the federal cases. We're not working on the state, West Virginia state cases, but we're doing that as well. So we're, yeah, we keep going in the spirit of the way we were started.
That's great. Well, you know, I do have to say that when we started the clinic in 1992 and 93, Keith was the IRS chief, you know, district counsel for Virginia and West Virginia. So as we've often noted, we were adversaries in the courts, etc. But Keith was a big promoter, and it is wonderful to see what he has done, and then wonderful to see what David has done moving forward. And that sort of brings me, you know, the idea of the funding that this Community Tax Law Project got, and sort of leads to our next kind of discussion about how the clinics have, you know, have different aspects based on the tax system that they're working in. But when, you know, CTLP, the Community Tax Law Project, started, one of the ways that we got the state funding was because in the United States there had been welfare reform, and a whole component of welfare payment, the welfare system reform, was to have a work requirement. You know, after a certain period of time, you were going to have work, or you were going to have to volunteer, unless there were conditions that didn't enable you to do that. And we thought very clearly on, you know, these folks are going to be thrown into the system and not have any idea how to take care of their tax situations. And we also saw the state of Virginia really focusing on getting people to do childcare in their homes as self-employed individuals, which meant they were going to have to be responsible for their own Social Security taxes, withholding from themselves, and, you know, keeping track of their records. And these are people who've never even worked before, often in their lives. And we were able to go into the General Assembly of Virginia and say, you know, we're going to be doing important work with them, both representing them, making sure that they get the credits that they're able to get, the refundable credits in the system, but also educating them. And it's good to hear, David, that that it's continuing on. But that was a really compelling message. I honestly think if we went in and just said, give us money to represent low income taxpayers, the question would be, how can low income taxpayers have tax issues, and you're competing with the private bar? But by framing it in the way that we did, we were able to get through, to them and get the camel's nose in the tent about state funding. So I don't know, let's throw this out there, like with the different tax regimes, how are you fitting in, and Emer, you've raised that yourself, that as you were thinking about setting up your clinic and you looked at US and you looked at Australia, you thought there were aspects that worked and didn't work with Ireland. So why don't you open the conversation? We can go from there.
Great, thanks, Nina. Yeah, I suppose what struck me, and it was concerned about it initially when I was having my own thoughts about how we might run it here, is that a lot of the material I read on the previous clinics in other countries talked about legal representation a lot. There was a lot of that. It was framed in those terms quite a lot. And in Ireland, I suppose, and particularly in our universities, and certainly in our university, tax is taught in the business school to people substantially going on for a career in accounting or a career in taxation. That's just the way it's grown. We have a small amount of tax law taught into law schools, but the idea of tax representation didn't sit well with me, or legal representation. So I said, well, in Ireland, how is it set up, and what kind of clinic then can we run in that context? And that's what brought us to working with the tax students of tax accounting, and also with tax advisors who are substantively coming from large and small and medium-sized accounting and broader consulting type firms, rather than let's say legal firms, even though into the future I'm hoping more legal will also get involved. And just on that, so that's how we set it up. So that's why it is different. It's different because the environment within which I operate is different to the environment in which the other clinics operate. I would also say, I think when we decided what we'd focus on this year, the Irish Revenue has just come through a very significant pay-as-you-earn modernization project. So it made sense then for us, if you like, to help citizens deal with the implications for them, or the interface and with the revenue and how it would change for them in light of this POE modernization. So that I think doing something like that can end up being quite smart and efficient, because that's you working with the administration as well, from the citizens' perspective. I would say the third point on this I thought I'd highlight is, in our third phase, choosing to work with enterprise centers isn't an accident. It's because we have a lot of them here. And it's about helping people transition from either unemployment or employment into running their own businesses. And as you will know, a lot of people in that situation, the last thing on their mind really is tax, accounting, anything like that. They're trying to make the widget and get it sold. And I think, again, that's very much an issue in Ireland. It may not be so in others. So it makes sense to reach out to the communities to serve, if you like, a very obvious need. So I would encourage people who might be on the call who are thinking about setting up clinics to take everything from what we're doing. But at the end of the day, I think you have to very much contextualize it within both the tax and the commercial environment within which you're operating.
That's really interesting about the startup business, because what you see is, someone starting and they're self-employed and they might be the single worker with maybe somebody, but once you start getting employees, that's when you get into real trouble. And if you're not prepared for that, the IRS data has shown that over and over and over. There's this life cycle where if you can make a smooth transition into dealing with your payroll tax responsibilities, you'll be good. But that's where when you start getting employees, you really critically get into tax trouble, and that can sink your business. So I don't know, Annette, you worked with ATO and, got this. So what are the features of, or Donovan, what are the features of Australia that you found sort of unique as you looked at the United States and thought how you were going to do your programs?
I think I'll start and then Donovan can come in. I think Australia has the issue that we have very complex tax rules. So whilst you might be, small, starting off a business, say as a self-employed business, we have rules, and I mean, as in anything with tax, we have acronyms. So we have like PSI, which stands for personal services income business or non-commercial losses. And people are trying themselves to say, I've got a business, and then they're doing their returns and thinking, well, what does this mean? What are these tests? I've got no idea. Whilst the ATO do a really good job of trying to promote educational and guides and all of this stuff, as you say, running a business is more important. I'm going to make that widget because I've got to do that to pay the bills. So we found that one of the best things for us to offer as well in our assistance area and education is to provide the necessary simplification, one, through education. So we've produced a whole lot of 5-minute animated videos on topics that people might come up against when doing their returns, as well as walking you through. Now, where clinics have a better benefit is that, whilst we get funding and assistance from revenues and governments, is that we really are independent. So we can take something that is a bit complex and simplify it and provide the answers. Like, we also have a tax volunteer system to help people do their returns, which is limited to $1 amount. But unfortunately, those advisors can't give advice. So if you wanted to say, could I claim using my car for work, they can only direct you to the necessary documentation available by the ATO. Where a clinic can say, well, let's look at your situation. How does it work? And we can provide the yes, no answer. So we felt that by doing that, more taxpayers would be lodging tax returns that are more complete and correct because they understand what they're lodging. Usually before, and we've done surveys on students previously, because we're very much also about education and schooling. So teach kids tax at school and produced documentations to help them as well. Is that they didn't have a clue when they did their first return. It was just like, just pop everything in, or dad told me to claim that because, everybody does, so you can have a go at it. So we really love the fact the clinic is an educator of educating taxpayers to get it right. And I think that's what people love about ours, is that they can come and ask questions, and we either have the facility to answer their questions or provide them guidance and say, look, a lot of students now are into crypto. I mean, I still can't get my mind around how that stuff works, but I got a group of our students in the clinic to put together, who understand it, trade it, to put together a video, to put together a brochure that can be downloadable and explain the tax consequences of crypto, so that these kids doing it think, well, hey, I've got a tax consequence every time I trade a crypto, or I dig. I think that's what they call it. So I think we found lots of areas. We had a lot of taxpayers who also had disengaged from the ATO for other reasons. As you said, they could have become homeless, or that they've got other issues that made them not continue with their tax obligation. But it got to a point when you haven't done something for 20 years and you're running a business, you can't get yourself out of that hole, because financially that's going to cost you a lot of money. But clinics can do that work. And as some of you have mentioned, our clinic is specifically law students and tax students doing commerce. So we have that really good niche of different types of students in that environment. So I find it works well that a lot of the accounting students are able to produce the documentation, to produce the return, the spreadsheets, where the law students are really able to engage in, representing the client. So did you have anything quickly you want to add, Donovan? Sorry.
Just a couple of themes that I want to highlight for the Australian context. And maybe one point to note at the outset is that even though each jurisdiction on this call has slightly different tax laws, I think it's important to recognize that the underlying philosophies of each tax clinic are broadly identical. And how we've contextualized them is twofold, essentially. So first we have the access to justice philosophy, which ultimately embeds everything that we do. So we want to service the community. We want to provide either representation, advice, education to either vulnerable or in-need members of the community. So that's first and foremost in our mind. And then I think we kind of contextualize how the laws or how our clinic will be operated or will be administered to kind of fit that philosophy. Secondly, and equally importantly, is the education philosophy. So education for taxpayers is very important, but as a clinic, particularly ours in an educational institution, it's about upskilling our future graduates. So focusing on developing technical skills as well as professional skills. In the Australian context, how we found it works well is our laws are complex, and giving students the opportunity to immerse themselves in real world situation helps them develop an understanding for how to interact with the law and how to translate that information in a valuable way to their particular client who might be undergoing various different other stresses, tax being just one of the issues that they're facing in their life. And then secondly, in terms of how we can inform on the policy and design issues associated with our taxation laws. So that systemic advocacy role as well kind of plays into what we do. And we see that by having direct contact with those that are most vulnerable or most affected by the tax law, perhaps even forgotten. So just wanted to draw those themes out in the Australian context as well. But despite the differences, I think there's a lot more commonalities than we often turn our minds to.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And it also leads to another issue that I was thinking about, and maybe I'll hand it to US and then go back to UK for a sec. You know, when you were talking about systemic advocacy, one of the things that has really happened with COVID, but in other areas, has been the ability to affect policies and bring litigation, where some of the initiatives that were implemented under COVID, you know, we felt violated the rights of certain groups of taxpayers, that they were left out in some way, or were not being addressed. And I also think, you know, when I started with the Community Tax Law Project, part of my brief on the program was definitely access to justice. And the argument that I made was that there's a whole group of taxpayers whose cases, although they may get into court, they never get the right arguments because they're representing themselves. Or if they're before the IRS, they may not get a proper result, the correct result, because they don't know how to navigate the system because they don't have representation. And Keith has made a different point. So maybe I'll turn this over to you, Keith, to talk about, you know, some of the things given the earned income credit and you know, the powers of the government and then certainly COVID, how you know, what has been happening in the courts has, where you've gotten wrong decisions, and what we would say are decisions that if the taxpayer had been represented, you might have gotten a different decision.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. I think there's a possibility of wrong decisions both at the administrative level with respect to wrong decisions when the IRS is writing regulations, if it doesn't have input from the community, and wrong decisions in the court if it's an adversarial system and it doesn't have the input from one party. I think one of the things that in the United States over the last decade, you've seen the tax clinics really ramp up to make comments on any proposed regulation by the IRS that will impact the low income taxpayers. And I'm hoping that over the coming decades that that initiative on the part of clinics to comment on regulations is going to pay huge dividends. I mean, I think if we look back to legislation that was passed 20 years ago, there were no one from the low income tax community was making any comments. And I can't really fault the IRS for not taking into consideration things that it maybe should have if the low income community had been making comments, but it made some decisions that make things very hard for the low income community. Then you're forced to try to deal with those things through litigation, which is much more difficult when you're fighting against the regulation. So So commenting on regulations and trying to make an impact by making sure that the regulators understand the problems faced by low-income taxpayers is a big deal. Additionally, in the United States, 95% of the litigation occurs in the United States, 95% of the tax litigation occurs in the United States Tax Court, and 70% of the litigants in the United States Tax Court are unrepresented. So clinics have, over the last, I would say 15 years, about 15 years ago, I think when Nina was the National Taxpayer Advocate, she began pushing for clinics to get more involved in the tax court practice. And the ABA began pushing to get coverage for every city where the tax court practices. And now we've seen over the last 10 years that every place the tax court goes, there's 74 cities in the United States where the tax court sits, and all have a clinic that will represent or take on of a low-income taxpayer who is otherwise pro se, which doesn't mean that every pro se case goes to trial with a representative, but a lot more cases are represented. I think a lot more cases are settling as a result. But for the cases that go to trial, where one party is represented, I think it hurts the system, because then you get precedent created when a judge is making a ruling without hearing good arguments on both sides. And so I'm engaged in a research project right now to look at the precedent that's been created in the tax court as a result of an unrepresented taxpayer being one of the parties, and looking at how can we create a system where the voice of that side is always heard by a representative. There's always a voice there, a representative making a pitch when the tax court's trying to decide something in a precedential way. So very important to have clinics both at the regulatory, I think, and at the litigation stage to be the voice for low-income taxpayers who otherwise don't have a voice.
Great. I don't know whether David has left the room or not.
No, I'm here. I ended up joining twice. I've logged out of one of them now, though. Yeah, for the UK, I can take you back. You mentioned earlier about people commenting, how can low-income people have tax issues?
Yeah.
There, and I think what we were finding is, for our clients, they haven't got a tax issue, but they've got a tax authority issue. In that, when you work out the income, there's no way they should be in the system, but somehow they've got caught up in it. Or even if they are taxpayers, the actual tax issue is fairly straightforward. But the way the UK system works is that most people need have no dealings at all with revenue and customs, as we call our administration there, because we do have in principle, we have a withholding tax from employment income that should precisely deduct the tax due for the year. But it's a system that was geared up, developed in the 1940s for people in permanent employment. So it's not sort of flexible enough to cope with those in the gig economy who are in and out of work. And people, the moment they find themselves self-employed, either through choice or forced into it, because that's the only way you'll get a job as a delivery driver, say, all of a sudden find themselves registered with HMRC and don't really know where to go next with it. So a lot of our time, because of the nature of the system, is people who've maybe 4 years behind with a tax return. The penalty for that is £1,600 a year, so that's over $2,000 for being a year late with your return, even if you don't owe any tax whatsoever. With that, which if you're on a low income already, is not a bill you can meet. So a lot of what we need to do is, first of all, try and persuade HMRC that they shouldn't need to submit a tax return in the first place, or else do our best to mitigate the penalties that flow from it. But it also used to be the case, my background's with our old Inland Revenue, back in the days when we had over 700 offices spread throughout the country. But HMRC now has shut itself off from taxpayers. It's retreated to, I think, 10 offices in major cities, none of which have any public access there. So we've got a system now which will only communicate with taxpayers, either on the telephone or through a YouTube video or dumbed down websites there. And unless you already know your way around the system, it can be hard to understand how it works. And once you find yourself, say on the websites, you find yourself in a loop that you can't get out of, and there's no one to turn to ask for guidance from that. So a lot of the feature of our system, or the bit of it, is a remote tax authority there, and people who aren't used to dealing with tax there, which I suspect with Australia and in the US, where virtually everyone I think is submitting a tax return every year, you sort of grow up with at least an awareness of what to do. Whereas for most folk in the USA, they can go all the way through school, start employment, and not realize that tax is really an issue they need to think about with that. As far as representation goes, we don't yet. The charity that we're linked with doesn't represent clients before tribunal. I think that's as much a resource issue as a matter of policy there. But there are things I would like us to do, we don't do yet, where you think often the tribunal is much more sympathetic to people's personal circumstances and the nature of difficulties. So the tribunal will accept reasonable excuses, say personal difficulties, mental health issues, caring responsibilities, as an excuse, or sorry, no, a valid reason for falling behind with your tax affairs, especially when you don't actually owe any tax. Whereas the revenue take a much more clinical approach and find it hard to accept that anybody can't understand what to do with the tax affairs, because isn't it straightforward with that one? So there's ones where I'd like us to get to tribunal with that, or at least be prepared to go to tribunal. So the revenue actually reviews things appropriately to start with. And for a lot of those cases, I think they only meet in London, Birmingham, Edinburgh, maybe Cardiff as well. As far as personal access to tribunals go, is difficult, even pre-COVID. But most of the cases we deal with can all be done by correspondence. So yes, you still get a judge making the decision, but it isn't actually necessarily a case of having to turn up and present evidence in person with there, which I think is something the clinic could manage well, and which students can still draft and get the experience of preparing arguments for courts without necessarily having to appear in person.
You know, in the United States, there is a process. It's both with the IRS and with the United States Tax Court, where students who are working in low-income taxpayer clinics under the supervision of whether it's a faculty member or in the context of maybe an intern in a non-academic clinic, but under a licensed attorney, would be able to, you know, advocate for the taxpayer, represent the taxpayer before the tax agency, and also make arguments in the tax court and in federal district courts and federal appellate courts. And I'm wondering with the other, you know, David, for example, in your country, whether that would be possible. Is there special permission for the students to do that kind of work?
A taxpayer can appoint any representative they like with that. I think the only barrier would be making sure our indemnity insurance is valid to cover it, and persuading the university that we're competent to do it. But as far as the tribunal system itself is organised, the rules there allow anybody to represent them. I think an individual judge can refuse to accept an individual if they feel they're not appropriate. But in principle, any representative can appear before the tribunal, certainly at the first tier level.
Okay.
So that isn't necessarily, that wouldn't be a bar to the students appearing with that one, or drafting the paper submissions.
You know, since we've been talking about the tribunals, maybe we could talk about just the relations with the courts and the tax tribunals. You you know, in the United States, Keith talked about the, you know, we lost David Sams for a minute. Now he's back, coming back. That Keith talked a little bit about the calendar call program. And there are whole swaths of the country that are unrepresented. You know, there are not a lot of tax lawyers in Wyoming or Montana, the rural areas. And with COVID, we're all experiencing virtual trials. And I'm wondering, you know, whether that we think that will actually expand the ability to get representation for these taxpayers, because it no longer has to be that you have to show up at a particular location if you're going to trial. I don't know whether Keith or David Sams, you want to weigh in on that at all?
I think that it will once we figure out the system. I know I picked up a client recently in San Francisco, all the way across the country from me, and it doesn't matter. I mean, in terms of trying the case, I mean it'll be tried the same as if the client lived 2 miles from my clinic. So in that respect, the virtual trials the tax court is holding now make it much easier. So I think to the extent that we build out the system properly, I think it'll be much easier to cover the rural areas that now suffer from a lack of coverage. So I think it's a question of the bar and the court, you know, just finding ways to make sure that there is coverage, but it'll be a lot easier to actually have the coverage occur.
I know that we've talked a little bit about, you know, the challenges in starting up a clinic, and I thought it would be good to maybe talk just briefly about relations with the tax agency and, you know, approaching them and saying, I want to do this clinic and we want to work with you, or approaching the court. People know the history of the Community Tax Law Project. There was certainly the tax court and the IRS both had programs before the Community Tax Law Project started in 1992, where it put in stuffer letters for the tax academic clinics that were available, telling unrepresented taxpayers before the court, you know, there's a clinic in your area who may be able to represent you. The IRS did it for taxpayers who were in the office having an administrative appeal where the academic clinics are. And when the Community Tax Law Project went in and said, well, what about us? We'd like to participate. Both the tax court and the IRS said no, it would not be in the best interests of the government or the tax court to make referrals to a program that used pro bono volunteers. And that made no sense. And we eventually got that changed. But, you know, you saw that kind of beginning tension. And as well, when I initially went out to the bar to get volunteers, I can remember the phone call that I had with a partner in a major law firm whose law firm had actually adopted a huge pro bono policy, encouraging all their lawyers. And he was going to talk to do pro bono, and he was going to talk to some of his, you know, associates to do pro bono. And he said, but we don't want to represent any, you know, deadbeats, people who have collection problems. And I thought, whatever, you know, I mean, those are what we have, sorry, you know, and just that those perceptions, even in the private sector, were really astonishing to me, you know, to encounter that. Fortunately, I encountered Keith in the Office of Chief Counsel at the IRS, who helped me, you know, introduced me to the director for that geographic area where the Community Tax Law Project was located in, and we had very good relations. But I'm interested in hearing folks about, you know, as you're starting this, what was your reception? Because I'm sure there are folks on the call that would be interested in knowing what you encountered.
So maybe if we want to go alphabetical again, I don't mind providing.
Yeah, do whatever. Yeah, go ahead.
The Australian experience. And I think we've been quite fortunate in Australia following our successful pilot in 2018, where it was really important for us to create an evidence base to show value in this program. And once we had constructed that, having those conversations surrounding funding and assistance became easier as time progressed. But insofar as the ATO is concerned, which is our tax authority, they now have a dedicated sector within their organization, which assists all 10 of the tax clinics. So if we have matters that require access to information and the clinic isn't registered as a tax agent, so can't access it independently, then they can support. And also with the more complicated dispute resolution processes, they can provide facilitators or dispute assist guides to our clientele to take them and channel them through that process, once again, if the clinics might not have capacity to do that. Interestingly, however, and once again, it should be noted that we don't operate as a solicitor clinic. We operate as a registered tax agent, but we have been approached by interested barristers, so members of our Australian and in particular the Western Australian bar, who have expressed an interest in wanting to work alongside the clinic to represent taxpayers who might otherwise be self-represented or not represented at all in the tribunal system. So as Annette alluded to at the start, our pipeline project for 2021-2022 is looking at how we might reshape our clinic to act as a solicitor that can then instruct barristers who are interested in performing pro bono services for these types of taxpayers. So I think in that respect, we have been incredibly fortunate, but the complexity came at the very start when we had to create an evidence base and have those difficult conversations about showing that this program is worth something to invest in. Once that, however, was accomplished, then as time has progressed, things have got a little bit easier.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that having been part of the administration of the LITC program as the National Taxpayer Advocate, you know, we were required to impose a lot of reporting responsibilities on the clinics as part of a federal grant program. And it is a burdensome task. I mean, all the clinics complain, but I think we had managed to explain to them that showing them, you know, the numbers of cases that have been represented, the outcomes in the cases, the dollars of refunds that were obtained, the dollars of liabilities that were reduced or abated, you know, the systemic advocacy that occurred, the court cases that you'd taken, were always to go back to Congress and say, look at this work that's being done, appropriate more dollars so we can have, you know, real clinic funding. And that needs to be thought about at the outset. If, as you say, if you don't have that evidence, then, you know, you're not going to be able to make your case for continuing on, much less expanding.
Just say something, Nina, as well. I think it's important with your tax authorities, wherever you are, whether you're starting out or you're still existing, is that you have those in the executive team who you can show what you're doing. As you say, reporting is great, but you know, if they're coming into your state, you know, the commissioner or the second commissioners and the executives is invite them into clinics and show them the work, let them talk to the students, let them talk to clients, because we found that was, you know, we had advocates in the beginning, and unfortunately advocates do move on, but we always found that the tax office, when they came in to the clinics and saw and got to speak and understand what the clinics were all about, they would walk out being your biggest advocate because they can see it. I mean, we report monthly, we do annual reports as well, and it's great putting everything in there, but as you say, sometimes it's the good stories that go in, but sometimes we want to show the authorities that you've got this person here, and have a chat to them and listen to why they've disengaged with you for 20 years, and you know that. And I really think that's a great thing, is working with the authorities and showing them what you do physically, inviting them in. We have an annual event each year to celebrate our clinic with the students, with our pro bonos, anybody that's helped us, and we extend that to our authorities. Come and, you know, celebrate what we've done and mingle and listen and talk to people. And I think having the authorities as your advocate is one of the, and it's mainly, as I said, you really got to have the top levels advocating for you to go, because they represent their authorities in government. And as you say, they can go to government and say, look, they're doing magnificent work. Can we fund them some more? We want to create more. So that's why I just thought I'd poke in there. Sorry.
So
So
Emer, you were
maybe-
going to say something, and then I wanted to
Yeah,
go.
I was just going to say that this is the benefit of not having been the first tax clinic ever, is that I get to learn from everybody else. And that point about evidence, Annette had mentioned to me when I was toying around with the idea, which is why I was so keen to, have a researcher on board at an early stage of the clinic. So, because for evidence, you obviously have to collect data, which means you got to set it up, not when the people are gone out the door of the clinic, but when they're coming in the door of the clinic, so that you're grabbing data every time you can. So I'd like to say that, that's the great thing about learning from your predecessors, if you like, with the initiative. And just in the Irish context, I would say early days, but so far so really good in terms of the positive reception I've received with the Irish Revenue. They are really interested. They're struggling to understand it exactly, just a little bit yet. And I think that therefore post-COVID, hopefully we'll be able to physically get them in to some of the sessions. But they're absolutely up for it. And in fact, I have a conversation with them again next week on the second rollout phase here. So, so far so good. But I do think it's a relationship that will be important, but also needs to be managed in a little bit of a quid pro quo. There's something in it for them, something in it for us. And I think that's the way the trust will be built.
Sorry, Nina, I could just add one further point, which might be helpful for anyone looking to potentially start a clinic. And I suppose this transpires into why we don't have such a strict eligibility criteria to this day, is because sometimes you don't know what gap needs to be filled. So if you're establishing a clinic with very restrictive eligibility practices, you might be missing out on other members of the community which might otherwise benefit from your services. So I suppose in that context, that's where Annette and I kind of thought we'd be a bit more flexible, see who would really benefit from this, so see who comes essentially, and then if need be, refine it from that point moving forward. And that's also a really valuable service that you can provide to your authority, because they themselves are only limited by the data they collect, which might have certain parameters around it, which might not be capturing everything that they needed to. So that's where clinics and the tax authority can work in a more of a research capacity than a service capacity.
Yep. Well, that's a good segue into, the issue of sort of broader issues. I guess it was yesterday, maybe the day before, Harvard Keith filed on behalf of the Center for Taxpayer Rights an amicus brief in a case in the Ninth Circuit dealing with the tolling of the starting of the statute of limitations and when a return was filed or not filed. And the taxpayer at issue is an entity. The dollars at issue are huge. It's a very sophisticated taxpayer, well represented. But the issue that was in the case was one that you could see unrepresented, low income, middle income taxpayers constantly being faced. And we felt very strongly was a violation, was the wrong reading of the law and the precedent of the law, but also a violation of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in the United States. And the brief sort of goes through that. And we have, when the center working with Harvard or Georgia State or some of the other clinics have filed briefs on cases, we've tried to make the point, even when they're high, very complex, high dollar, multinational entities or whatever, that the issue at stake has downstream consequences to low income and unrepresented taxpayers. And so just don't look at the issue in light of the taxpayer right before you and think, well, this taxpayer should have known, because this scenario is repeated over and over and over again with taxpayers who will not know, do not understand the system and their fundamental principles at stake here. And in that way, we've been able to intervene in cases where we couldn't take the taxpayer on ourselves, but we can make the argument for the group of taxpayers that may be unrepresented. And I have to say, you know, Keith's work in that area with the Harvard Clinic has been really groundbreaking, and we're working with other clinics to get up to speed on that. I know David, Massey, and Amy, you all have a project with prisoners, and I thought maybe we could close before we go into some questions with you describing that, and then Keith, maybe you could describe your exoneree work.
You know, a couple of years ago, the Harvard Clinic got involved with the exonerees in the United States because Congress passed a law in 2015 that excluded from their income any receipt that they got as a result of their wrongful incarceration. And prior to that law change in 2015, if you received payment because of wrongful incarceration, it was taxable income. When Congress changed the law in 2015, they created a window of time for exonerees to claim any tax they had paid in prior years, and we got involved in helping to represent people who were trying to file refund claims during that window. But as a result, we created a relationship with an organization that represents exonerees. And so today we represent, through that organization, any exonerees in the States who have a tax problem, no matter what the tax problem is. We're wrapping up a case in the state of Virginia right now where the exoneree was receiving a 1099 wrongfully because the state pays the exonerees by bidding out an annuity contract, and the annuity contractor just never picked up the change in the law, so has continued to issue 1099s reporting all of the payments as taxable income. And so the IRS came to this individual and said, you didn't report this, and he didn't report it properly, but we had to prove to the IRS that the payment came from the source of the payment was really an effort to repay him for his wrongful incarceration. So we've represented exonerees on quite a variety of issues. They just have the re-entry into life after spending 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years in prison can be difficult. And tax issues are just one small part of that difficulty, and we're happy to try to assist those individuals who've gone through such a rough patch of life.
So Amy, I don't see David back in on the system. Maybe he is, but Amy, maybe you want to talk about your prison project?
So it's not, I must admit, it's not my project at all. It is very much David and Debbie's project, who is also on the call. So I don't really want to take too much of their limelight, but it's a fantastic project that is essentially working with individuals. Debbie, I don't know if you can pitch in.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Amy. I'm not quite sure where David is, but yeah, I'll pitch in. Thanks, Amy. So from the tax clinic that Amy and David were doing, we were approached by a social enterprise who work with prisoners who have got various tax issues, both when they are going into a prison environment where they might have penalty notices issued because the other authorities haven't been notified that they're actually in prison. And then also there's other issues as well, obviously, then when they're coming back out of the prison environment. So that started as a tax project, and it's absolutely got a very strong tax theme. We're looking at working with the social enterprise, getting our students involved and looking at helping these prisoners who've got tax refund issues. And we're also looking and picking up some of the things that we discussed earlier on in the call about self-employment opportunities for people coming out of a prison environment, and trying to get things right from the start for them when they're coming out into the world of work again. So we're looking at making sure they're aware of sort of basic legal form of business and self-employment tax issues where they've got to register with, and we're doing all of that with the social enterprise. So it's a bit of a joint project with the social enterprise, but getting our students involved, and that is going into a pilot from next Monday when the students finish their exams. So it's all very, very new, but exciting experience for our students. And yeah, so we're excited about that project. Thank you.
That's really wonderful. All right, so maybe I'll just open this up for some questions if anybody has them, and you can put them in chat. I'm not sure that I see anybody, but if anybody else wants to, of the guests want to chime in on some of the initiatives. I will say, go ahead, Annette.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Australia, well, the Curtin Tax Clinic is also starting a prisoner program when I return to Australia. We've got the approvals from the prisons to enter. So we previously were working with an organisation that helped prisoners on their release, and we were doing the educational type thing of like, you know, if you're self-employed or employed, these are the new rules, because as you say, some people could be in there for a long time. We also did a double check, like we have, being a registered agent, we have the authority to get all the information on that person at any time if they give us their tax file number. So to look and say, look, you've got 10 years worth of returns, we'll just lodge these as nil because you were in prison. Some have even come out with receiving some tax refunds because they didn't realize they had outstanding. And then that brought us to the thing, well, if they had problems and they got out that were there when they went in, maybe we need to start from the beginning rather than have a program that starts at the beginning as well as the end. So we're really looking forward to, I did before I just came over here, went into a prison environment to see, we're looking at maximum security to minimum security prison farms. So we're doing the broad range. We're going to train the students as well to go into that. But again, as you know, the UK one is that it's important sometimes to work with an organization first. You know, we worked with an Indigenous organization for the pre-release, and that gave us the insight of, okay, this is what we want to do, but using their contacts into government systems to prisons allowed us to actually branch out a little bit on our own, but we needed them to get started, basically. So I think it's really important that where you can tap into organizations that currently exist and work with them is amazing, like homeless organizations, Salvation Armies, those type of people can really help give you a broader range of clients that might not have never known that you were there to help them. So yeah, just wanted to say that.
That's great. I just thought I would say, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, but I thought I would just maybe, and this will be a good way to close things, is to talk about just some future opportunities. The first thing is a shameless plug for the Center for Taxpayer Rights. One of the things that we have been doing on the US side is the litigation strategy call that's pretty much weekly. And it started in the context of some of the COVID initiatives, bringing, you know, some of the most active clinics together to meet weekly and really try to think about, as one person said, approach issues as a national law firm in a way, so that you could do strategic litigation or even strategic audit work, you know, whatever it was. And that proved very successful with some of the COVID initiatives. And so we're continuing those calls and branching beyond just the COVID, you know, economic relief provisions to longstanding issues that we've had with the tax, you know, thinking about the tax system, whether it's on the administrative side or the litigation side. And then the center recently received some funding to create a nationwide pro bono referral network, which would, as I keep trying to explain it, is a dating app in a way for clinics who are in some of the more rural areas or have very specific needs that they don't have the ability to, they don't have the expertise or something, to be matched up with volunteers that may be in a different geographic area, but are willing to do volunteer work. And this is particularly important for our rural populations, our Native American populations, you know, things like that, where there may not be a lot of tax lawyers wandering around, and really be a matchup against, you know, with the programs asking for requests. And it doesn't have to be just representation. It can be, we need training on a particular issue, or we need a mentor on a particular issue, or, you know, something like that, somebody to help write training materials. And so I'm really happy about that. And then the final thing is just a reminder that We have two international conferences on taxpayer rights coming up, one in May, at the end of May in Athens. We have no idea whether we'll really be there in person or we'll be all virtual. Stay tuned for that. But certainly in October in South Africa, we will plan to be there in person. And what we're trying to build into the international conferences is that the afternoon before the commencement of the two-day conference, we would have a clinic workshop. And that would be, and these will be also streamed. All the conferences will now also be live streamed as well as in person. And this will be an opportunity to have more panels in detail, like, you know, what are the logistics of actually starting a clinic? Now that you're at a mature stage or you're working about sustainability, what are the next steps to keep your clinic being alive? And then maybe looking at litigation, you know, how do you begin to do litigation, or where does that fit in? And again, sharing more details about the models. And I'm hoping it will be an opportunity for more people to sign in who want to start clinics. So we'll have a huge population of people who can present on panels. But that's sort of the future that we really want to encourage, that this really be, it's already an international movement, but we'd love several other continents along the way too. So I don't know whether anybody wants to say anything else in closing. And if not, we'll just sign off. Anybody have some closing remarks or thoughts?
I think, Nina, that most of us here, you know, especially from Australia and UK and Ireland and the future ones, you know, need to thank you for showing, you know, you created a movement in the US and we've used your model. I mean, we've tinkered with it a little bit, but, you know, all thanks go to you for starting this movement. And I know myself and Donovan are really looking forward to having an international movement of tax clinics because, as I said, when I met you, you know, I can't bake cakes or whatever, and so I can't give back to the local cake stall. But, you know, I think a lot of us are really good at tax, and you've given us an avenue to use our talents in a pro bono way. And especially in Australia too, we've never had a pro bono environment of tax professionals, and there's a real excitement that this is now how people can give back with things that they're good. So we'd just like to say thank you for showing us the light, and you'll always be the grandma of tax clinics. Thank you.
That's really sweet. But, you know, it took so many people, and Janet Spraggins, the late Janet Spraggins, was definitely my partner in all of this in those early days. And now to see what the clinics are doing is just really fabulous. And I will just, maybe I'll close with, I remember one day, you know, I gave a case, one of the members of the American Bar Association tax section's leadership came to me, and he was in a completely different state, but he had a problem with his housekeeper had a problem with the IRS, and he needed help with it, like, you know, and I sort of held his hand through this issue. And for years, he talked about the complexity of this particular provision of the law, the earned income credit. And he was somebody that did mergers and acquisitions and the tax aspects of it. And he just, all he could talk about was the complexity of the earned income credit. And we are asking low income people to navigate that. And I thought there's just no replacement for that, to have that hands-on experience of seeing what taxation can do both for the good and the bad of taxpayers. And I think that's another thing that it's part of the education that clinics do, not just in the academic field, but just in the tax profession as well. Well, thank you all for this wonderful program. I'm really grateful to you, and Donovan, really grateful to you for staying up this long. Now go to bed. Okay. Thank you, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.